Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining in. Okay, so let's get started, team. Now, as we progress in today's session, we'll be discussing about the AWS Fargate, and this is how this session's agenda would look like. So we'll start with overview, that is the origin of this AWS Fargate, and we'll understand what exactly is this AWS Fargate, and then we will look into the demo of this AWS Fargate. So this is the agenda for today's session. So let's get started. Now, if I want to give you a high level idea as what you can expect in this solution architect certification training program, here, this solution architect training program covers end to end, which are required for you to prepare yourself for your certification journey with AWS. In the first module, you will have an introduction to AWS. And in the second module, it's about security management in AWS. Third module is about the Amazon EC2. Fourth module is about the storage options that we have got. Fifth module is load balancing, auto scaling, and Route 53. Sixth module is about the database services and the analytics. Seventh is about the networking and the monitoring service. Eighth module is about the application services and the AWS Lambda. And the ninth module is about the configuration management and the automation using the cloud formation. And the 10th module is about the DevOps on cloud, which is the additional content that will be shared to you so that as a learner, you not only prepare yourself from the AWS Solution Architect certification training, but also gain the perspective as how the DevOps strategy can be implemented on the AWS cloud. So as you can clearly see, the curriculum has been carefully selected and created. And just to let you know, this overall curriculum has been created by browsing through and by researching through 5,000 plus job requirements from the various companies through from the entire world. Based on that, this quality content has been created so that as a learner, you will become the industry ready by the completion of this training program. Okay, so moving on in a learning journey. So let's have an understanding about the origin of this AWS Fargate. So here, when we talk about this AWS Fargate, so it all it actually started from the concept of containerization. So when we talk about this containerization here, this containerization has actually transformed the overall cloud architecture over the past few years. And with the help of this containerization, the business were able to build, deploy, and manage the application at a very faster rate. And the momentum behind these containers is very high, and it's definitely not the other way around. I would say, like, there will not be a chance where containers will going away. So that's one of the important concept, or that's one of the important thing that we observe in the cloud world. And when we talk about this container and the container orchestration services, there are a variety of options that we have got available. But when we talk about these containers, it is us, that is as a developer or as a cloud architect, we have to configure and manage the cluster of these virtual machine for the containers to run. So that's the typical way that we have to do it. So the infrastructure management and management of these clusters are being done manually. Now that's where the AWS Fargate comes into picture. So here, when we talk about this AWS Fargate, so what it actually does is it will take care of the automation of this container and the container orchestration as well. Now, when the container services was not actually present, what user used to do is the users were actually launching their applications on the virtual machine. That's like the running the applications on EC2. So the developer, they were launching their application on this virtual machine. It could be an EC2. Okay, that is the EC2 instances. So what they have did was they packaged their application with the operating system into what we call it as Amazon machine image, and then they were running it on this AWS EC2 instance. So they were creating the app package, this app package containing the libraries, code, system tools, and web framework, and then they were actually running it on this EC2 instances. So this is what the developers used to do. Then the containerization concept came into picture. So the Docker, the company, they actually introduced the containers. And what it actually resulted is the developers started deploying their application on these containers. Now these containers, they actually resemble the virtual machine. But the core difference is that unlike virtual machine, the container share the host system's kernel with other container. So we have got the host system kernel, and the host system kernel is shared with the other containers. So this is a diagram which talks about how does the virtual machine would look like. So in case of virtual machine, we've got a server. On top of this server, we'll have a hypervisor. You can think of the hypervisor as a virtual box or VMware or anything. Those are some of the examples of hypervisor. Now, on top of this hypervisor, we will have two guest OS can be installed, and on top of this, like with the help of this guest OS, so we'll be running the application. So this is the overall idea about running the application on the virtual machine. Okay, now this was the idea about the virtual machine. Now, in case of container, as I've clearly mentioned here, we'll not have a specific operating system. So what we will have is like we'll have a server. On top of the server, we'll have an hypervisor and we'll have a guest OS. On the same guest OS, we'll have a Docker engine. On top of this Docker engine, I'll be running my Docker containers. And here, the kernel and all those things were actually being taken from the host system kernel. Okay, so all these containers, I've got two different containers right here. Now both the containers, they share the host system's kernel. Okay, the host system kernel is being shared with multiple containers that we have got. So as these containers started becoming more and more popular, the people started using them at a huge scale. Now the number of containers in EC2 instances actually increased it, now which in turn increased the number of instances. So what they have done was, okay, the AWS launched the Elastic Container Service, which we call it as the ECS, AWS ECS. So what exactly is this ECS? So ECS, or the Amazon Elastic Container Service, is a highly scalable, high performance container orchestration service. So what this has resulted is, this has reduced some overhead which users had to manage. So here, with the help of this, so this actually helped us in reducing the overhead which the users had to manage, but we still had the issue of the users still had to manage the underlying instances, and they have to monitor the applications running, the resources available and resources consumed. So the customers or the users had to still manage all these things, even though we are using the ECS. Now, when most of the companies or the customers started using this ECS, now AWS or the Amazon being a customer-centric company, so by analyzing the data, the AWS came up with one service that could handle the underlying virtual machine where the users can focus on building their application, and that service is actually called as AWS Fargate. Okay, so that service is actually called as the AWS Fargate. Now, this AWS Fargate is a compute engine for Amazon Elastic Container Service. Now, using this, we can run the containers without having to worry about provisioning the server, configuring the server, and even scaling the clusters of virtual machine that the host container application. So with this, my AWS Fargate eliminates the need for users to manage the EC2 instances on their own. In fact, whenever you're working as a developer, you don't have to use the EC2 instances at all. The Fargate that we have got, so it will act as a compute engine. Now it will help you to focus on the elements like designing, constructing the application, instead of managing the infrastructure that runs them. Now here, while working with Fargate, we can also choose the launch type. So while choosing the launch type, all we have to do is package the application in the format of container. And then we just have to specify the memory and the CPU requirement and define the IAM policies and launch the application. So that's how easy it is to work with AWS Fargate. So with this AWS Fargate, it will host and manage the containers. It will offer seamless scaling, and it is closely integrated with ECS and EKS. ECS is Elastic Container Service and EKS is Elastic Kubernetes Service. And we also have the other advantage, that is we don't have to manage the EC2 instances. So this is the overall idea about this AWS Fargate. So with this AWS Fargate, it will make it easy for us to scale the application. So once you define all your application requirement, this AWS Fargate manages all the scaling and the infrastructure which is required for us to run the containers in a highly available manner. Okay, that's the overall idea about this AWS Fargate. And here, this is the steps that I mentioned. We'll have to specify the container image. And while working, we just have to mention the container type. And that's the overall idea. See, if I want to give you an idea of the how it actually works. So before we generally start working with this AWS Fargate, so in general terms, when we are working with a container, here I'm talking about the building a container image, right? So here when I say container is nothing but a Docker container, which is a standardized unit of software development. And this Docker container contains everything that your software application requires in order to run the code, runtime, system tools, as well as the system libraries. Okay. Now these containers are created from read-only template that is called as a container image. Okay. Now here, first we have to build this container image. Now this container image is nothing but these are the images which are typically built from the Docker file, which is a plain text file, which specifies all of the components that are included in the container. The images are stored in the repository from which they can be downloaded and they can actually run into a container. Okay, they can actually run in the container. And then there is something called as task definition, which you will come across while working with AWS Fargate. So a task definition is nothing but a text file, which is also known as which is actually a JSON text file in JSON format. And this describes one or more containers that form the application. And we'll also have something called as a task. A task is the instantiation of the task definition within a cluster. And you'll also come across the term called cluster. Cluster is basically the logical grouping of resources. So if I want to give you an idea, okay, so I'll have something called as a task definition. Okay, I'll have something called as a task definition. And this task definition will be this will be sent for my Amazon ECS. Okay, so then like here while working, if we use the EC2 launch type, then our clusters will be the group of EC2 container. Okay, that is the overall idea. Now this diagram that you see here on the screen, so this diagram gives you a rough idea as how to deploy the application on ECS using this AWS Fargate. So first, you would require to build a container image. Okay, you have to first build the container image. Now, once you build this container image, the next thing that you are going to do is you have to build it and you have to store it in a repository. I think that is missing. You'll have to store it in a repository. Then you are going to choose the container orchestration service. It will be either ECS or EKS. And you're going to assign the resources for your application. Now, once you have done that, you need to create a cluster, or you need to create a cluster to group all those assigned resources. You need to create a cluster to group all your resources to your application. Like once you have done that, I think that is when you would choose the AWS Fargate launch type. Now, AWS Fargate will then launch and run all your containers. So here, while working, it manages all the underlying infrastructure and the clusters for us. It also seamlessly scales the application without having us to bother about it. So that's the best part about this AWS Fargate. So this is the overall idea about this AWS Fargate. Now, let's have a look into the key concepts related to the AWS Fargate. So one of the key concept related to AWS Fargate is the containers. So, okay, this I've mentioned already. Container is nothing but a Docker container, which is a standardized unit of software development, and will create the container image using the Docker file. And once we create the container image, we'll store it in a container registry. Okay, and we'll create a task definition. Task definition is something like a plain text file, which is in a JSON format. And this is an example of a task definition. Now with this task definition, so this is the overall structure. So like we'll create a task, which is the instantiation of the task definition within a cluster. And cluster is basically the logical grouping of the resources which our application require. Okay, that's the overall idea about the key concepts in the AWS Fargate. Now that you have an overall idea about this AWS Fargate, let me just give you a demonstration as how to work with this AWS Fargate in a very simple manner. So in order to do this, I'll first log into my AWS console. So let me just go ahead and do that. So I'll just log into my AWS account. Okay, I'm now logged into my AWS console. So let's go ahead and perform this hands-on activity. All right. So first thing that we'll be doing is we'll go to the Fargate. Okay, I'll go to the Fargate. So here I'm in my Amazon Elastic Container Service. And here you can ensure that you are in the required region. In this example, I've selected the region as AP South 1. Okay, so we'll click on the Get Started. Okay, now here in the screen, so I'll click on the Create Cluster. So through this, we can go ahead and work with the ECS service, and we can create the cluster configuration, and we can just go ahead and get started. Okay, now there's something that I want to show you, team. Okay, so let me just use the old console, team. Okay, so here in the ECS itself, we'll click on Get Started. And here we've got an option that says getting started with ECS using Fargate. So this is the overall idea. Now to get started, here we can specify the container definition. For demonstration purpose, the sample app is selected. Okay, and then we can define the task definition as per our requirement. So here for the demonstration purpose, the task definition name is set as first run task definition. The network mode is AWS VPC. It will create a task execution role as create new. The compatibilities is Fargate. And this is the overall configuration, which are the default configuration. So if required, we can also modify these values, that is a task memory and the task CPU. Now, once that is done, here, I'll just click on the next button. Now define the service. So now while defining the service, we can either specify the load balancer or not. I'll keep it as none, which is a default value. Okay, I'll click on the next button and we can specify the cluster name. I'll say my container. That's the value that I would specify. And I'll click on the next button. Okay, now once everything is done, I'll click on the create. Okay, so now we can validate the overall launch status. So currently it is getting launched. Now we can also see what exactly is happening. So first it has created the my container, and the task definition is my first run task definition. Okay, now if I go to my EC2, okay, so if I have any instances that are being initiated, okay, assuming that it will use the ECS server EC2, then if it is based on EC2, we'll be able to see all those things inside this EC2 container. That's the overall idea right now. So currently it is still pending. Let's wait over here. Currently the ECS resources is still getting created. I'll click on view service. Okay, so we can see that the overall service is active. Okay, now once this is done, so we can actually look for the IPv4 address and we can check whether it is actually running or not. Okay, that's the overall idea, team. So let me just show you. Okay, so it says service has reached steady state. That's great. And I can click on this task definition if I would require, and we can actually manage everything right here, team. All right, so this is the overall idea. So what we have done is we have launched an application using the AWS Fargate in an hands-on manner, which is a sample application. Okay, so that is what we have done as part of this hands-on activity. All right, team. So now with this, we come to the end of this today's session, team. So thank you so much, everyone. And do check out the course on Edureka to learn more and to understand how you can progress better in this topic of AWS.